Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. So we've talked a little about Nezarec in the context of the raid, but now it's time to talk a little bit more about his greater influence across both our world and the worlds beyond our reach. Today it's time to bring Nezarec up in the context of his acolytes. It might be a little hard to understand who these nebulous figures are at first, and how far back they date, so before we truly talk about them, a little disclaimer. This is probably going to be a multi-part series because they are the majority of the Nezarec lore. This is probably going to explain a lot of lore via me telling you the story of these acolytes, and before we do any of that, we need to definitely talk about Nezarec in the context of his own power. So let's go ahead and just start by doing exactly that. Whilst currently we know scant little about Nezarec's origins, and we know only the smallest fraction about the moment in which he became a disciple, what we do know about Nezarec is that he is a being of remarkable psionic power. Psionic or psychic power is badly understood in Destiny's universe, but from what we can tell, it isn't necessarily tied to either light or dark in a strict sense. Psions, for example, have their void blasts, and void is generally a thing of the light, but the actual blasts themselves come from the Psion's mind, and minds are not a thing of the physical universe. They are a thing of thought, which is the domain of the darkness. So all of that is to say that psionic power may in fact be its own thing, a kind of third way if it is in fact paracausal, but even that isn't necessarily known yet. So until we get more lore about the exact nature of psionic power from Bungie, unfortunately we're not necessarily going to understand quite where this fits in the context of Destiny's universe. So, what kind of psychic powers are possible for Nezarec? I think if you're going to ask that question, you first need to make a distinction between Nezarec's power when he's alive and Nezarec's power when he's dead. Confusing? Yeah, go ahead and check out my last video on how Savathun killed Nezarec if you're wondering why we're asking this question. When Nezarec is alive and well, he seemingly is capable of complex manifestations, which all seem to take place within the context of fear, pain, and nightmares. When he's dead, these powers are still accessible, but with a far lesser scope of power. But when he's alive, it's implied, thanks to him in the raid telling us, that these powers could even be strong enough to kill if he commanded or desired it. Apparitions of Nezarec appearing in various different places where he is worshipped or revered is not unheard of, and it also appears to be the case that when alive he can manifest a sort of shadow near his victims. The possession of victims and their subsequent descent into madness is something that Nezarec takes a great degree of pleasure in. In one story later in this series of videos, we may even cover how Nezarec's madness was powerful enough to overcome even a Guardian. These powers that Nezarec displays seem to leave imprints upon those that witness them, regardless of species. In the lore, we can see entries that seem to imply that Psions, Eliksni, and either a human or an Awoken, although most likely a human, are all affected, and that is therefore an implication that allows us to say that Nezarec could realistically affect almost anyone, as long as they dream, probably. Remember how Nezarec asks if the Vex can dream? Yeah, that's probably for a reason.
Do Vex dream? Or are they simply circuitry and programming?
In one way or another, everyone who experiences Nezarec's influence will be touched by that moment, and some amongst that number count themselves amongst the acolytes of Nezarec. They have experienced his terror in one way or another, and they have found a horrifying commonality amongst themselves that has drawn them into some kind of loose affiliation. They might not even necessarily have a grand goal in mind that is achievable. It is stated by Michael, the leader of the Acolytes of Nezarec, that the manifestation of Nezarec on their plane is their objective, and yet it doesn't seem entirely clear whether this is possible or not. Regardless of their goals, their formation is a side effect of a sadistic creature that undoubtedly revels in all of the acts that they perform in his name, if he deigns to give them his attentions. So who are the members of this cult of acolytes that we know of thus far? Well, of all of them, it's worth noting that we know of 6 individuals that are tied to the cult of Nezarec, as I'm going to call it. Nezarec's quote-unquote 6 acolytes for the moment are known because each of them is named after a raid weapon. We know thus far of acolytes bearing the names of Acacia, Coraxis, Rufus, Nessa, Briar, and their leader who is known as Michael. Now, whilst I just stated that Acacia was one of the acolytes, she is one of the important exceptions to this. A little bit of nuance is that with her weapon, Acacia's dejection, the flavor text reads, "Do not believe their lies, run." So the implication seems to be that Acacia joined the acolytes temporarily and then fled upon discovering how deranged they all actually were, and that there was nothing that she could gain. We'll be covering her story in our second video in this particular set of videos about the acolytes of Nezarec, so don't worry, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of that, not just because it's going to help us fill in that particular blank, but also because she's a scion, and her story is really important. But for this first video, I wanted to focus on someone else. I wanted to focus on the leader of the acolytes, Michael. Michael's relation to Nezarec is one that is drawn not only from the connection that can be found in Nightmares, but also from a connection that has bound him to Nezarec in blood. Michael apparently was in a position to carry on the legacy of his family, which was one that chose to worship Nezarec. The scary thing is that this is clearly something which has been going on for far longer than one might necessarily imagine, and we know that because it's all tied up in a book. Remember the Nezarec's sin lore tab? If not, don't worry, I'm not going to reread it for you even though it's very short and you should reread it for yourselves. Just know that the lore of Nezarec's sin supposedly comes from a pre-Golden Age text. The name of that text is Of Hated Nezarec. The fact that this book, this tome, is pre-Golden Age means that in contemporary terms, Nezarec would have made some kind of presence here on Earth 10 years ago by current date, or sooner in Destiny's timeline if it had panned out in the real world. It's unclear when Nezarec's presence was established, but what we do know is that the one pre-Golden Age text that survived is the key artifact that has been passed from family member to family member, and now has reached Michael. The tome Of Hated Nezarec isn't confirmed to make an appearance in the lore from Root of Nightmares. I should make that clear. A book is confirmed to make an appearance, but it's so heavily implied that it is this one same text that I figure it's worth assuming it. Most of the stories of the Acolytes at some point feature a leather-bound tome, and it only seems to make further sense given that Michael and his weapon, the Michael's Reverence, seems to have a quote from Of Hated Nezarec. At very least the wording seems very similar. I think the best introduction to Michael as a character is actually his appearance in the Dream Demon Sparrow, which also contains an appearance of the tome. This is in collections currently, but it's not obtainable until the Master Challenges of Root of Nightmares are released, which, needless to say, aren't live just yet. The Sparrow's lore tab and flavor text reads as follows. Feed your fear to the fiend. Allow your nightmares to fuel his inevitable return. Of Hated Nezarec. Michael was sweating. I noticed it when I woke him from a deep slumber the night of his 18th birthday. It was late, almost the time of nightmares, and tonight I would pull back the curtain. The leather-bound tome I dropped on the table made him jump. I could tell by the way he blinked up at me under the basement's singular light that he was lost, confused and afraid. I smiled. Nightmares are not to be feared. My hands ran over the ornate shapes on the tome's cover, the symbols of an ancient being, and I slowly opened the latches. The book appeared to breathe. He has haunted slumbers long before the Golden Age, and with every new generation, he tests our worthiness, our loyalty. I flipped to a page filled with an image corner to corner, weighted by layers of charcoal and blood. A lock of hair was sewn into the tome's gutter. The text on the next page also shimmered crimson. Tonight, you will carry on our legacy. Before Michael could muster a breath to argue or ask questions, the sound of rattling chains filled the room. Michael turned and peered into the darkness at the back of the room. The soft chitters of an Elixni I'd captured earlier that day joined the metal chorus as it tugged at its restraints. I led him forward and lit the sconces on the wall, revealing the prisoner in question. Michael looked up at me, eyes wide and tearful. Extract its fear, I instructed. This was Michael's initiation, performed by him at the instruction of a parent. Fear was extracted from an Elixni that day, and fear was gifted to hated Nezarec. I can't imagine that Elixni is still alive. But something that isn't clear in this moment is the time in which it takes place. The extract seems to be taking place in the past at very least, if not simply because of the fact that this seems to be the framing of a memory from when Michael was turning 18. This all, of course, seems to be from the perspective of a parent or a family member who is of an elder generation. But regardless, their tradition here is made clear. The one thing that we can relate as far as time is concerned is that this does appear to be after the Golden Age, and some point when the people of the city are existing on their own. It may be that this is unbelievably contemporary, maybe even as recently as when the Elixni House of Light joined us in the season of the Splicer, but I somewhat doubt it. Something about this makes me feel as though this was a few years prior to that, or maybe even a few decades. Regardless, the point is this. Nezarec's core acolytes used the tome known as Of Hated Nezarec, or another tome that is incredibly similar, and pass on the tradition from family member to family member, down the generations in an unending chain of nightmares crawling forth through eternity. And it appears that Michael took to his new position and became the leader of the acolytes, given the name of his raid weapon, Michael's Reverence. A reminder for those who do not know, to be reverent towards something is to view it as an object worthy of great respect or even worship, and that seems quite appropriate given that the flavor text of this weapon seems to quote Of Hated Nezarec, or at least it feels as though it does given the cadence of the wording. The flavor text on Michael's Reverence reads, "Pain, fear, sacrifice, feed the fiend. Michael, leader of the Acolytes of Nezarec." But the more ominous question does not lie in the fact that Nezarec's acolytes are passing their traditions onward. It is not the future that may never happen that should concern us first and foremost. It is how deeply the past lies buried in this chorus of nightmares. The traditions that have been passed down by Michael's family may be but a fraction of Nezarec's influence. When worship of Nezarec truly began is a question that we may never truly get answers to. And yet, one thing does seem clear: we were not the first. The Scions and their connection to Nezarec are what we're going to explore in depth next. as we explore the lore surrounding Acacia and what happened when an acolyte found her deep in the jungle. That's all from me for now. If you enjoyed this video and you want to hear more about the raid lore and about the acolytes of Nezarec, go ahead and leave a like and let me know down below in the comments section. I, for one, am really excited to cover these stories. This is some of the coolest lore that we've gotten in a while, and honestly, the stories that come out of the armor lore tabs in particular, they're fantastic. I really cannot wait to read all of these to you. In the meantime though, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications so you can stay up to date with all of this lore. But, as per usual, know that your viewership as always is quite enough for me, and that in the meantime my name is Byf. Rodacia ad Astra. I'll see you Starside.